Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate doing the learning about the interpreters. I want to introduce myself. I'm Congressman Alan Lowenthal. I represent the 47th Congressional District in Congress, which is almost all of Long Beach, Catalina, and also Western Orange County. So it's a complex district. Today we're focusing on the environmental justice issues, which are my residents primarily on the west side and the northern part of the city of Long Beach. I want to start this by thanking the panelists who are here, the interpreters who have joined us tonight, and I'm really looking forward to, as we go on, a kind of a meaningful discussion between all of us. I want to start by just, talking about the collective loss that our country, our city, our state has experienced over the past 10 months. Over 300,000 people in our country have lost their lives. Many of us have lost their loved ones. I continue to worry about the most vulnerable parts of our community, and we'll be talking more about that tonight, some of the most vulnerable part. Here in California, the last month has seen a staggering, in the last week, even more staggering rise in cases and deaths. We're up to now over 300 deaths a day. This is an unbelievable number. And I just really want to say, anybody that's watching this, wear a mask, practice social distancing, and stay home as much as you can. Just this week, vaccines began to roll out all over the country. I look forward to working with my colleagues in the district and across California to ensure everyone has access and accurate information about the vaccine, and that the vaccine is distributed to those who are most in need, and not just given to those who are the wealthy and who can afford the vaccine. Tonight, we're going to discuss the impact that coronavirus has had specifically on the environmental justice communities. When we talk about environmental justice, what are we talking about? What does it mean? To me, environmental justice is the principle that everyone, regardless of race, income, religion, gender, has a fundamental right to clean air, clean water, and a clean environment. Unfortunately, this fundamental right is not equally protected, and it's not upheld frequently. When you think about where the most polluting industries are often located, consider who their neighbors are. These fence line communities or environmental justice communities living next to refineries and freeways are typically lower income Black, Latino, and in Long Beach, also Cambodian, Samoan, and Filipino communities. In these communities, we see higher levels of air pollution, higher levels of respiratory illness, lower access to green space like parks, and limited availability of groceries and produce. We also see in these communities tremendous disparities in accessing the health system, having health insurance, housing disparities, educational disparities, and also how people experience the criminal justice system. Now we're seeing early research that's identifying the possible relationship between long-term exposure to air pollution and vulnerability to the coronavirus. This virus has continued to expose countless inequalities in our society. And if we want this and we want to prevent this from happening again, we're going to have to deal with and address the ongoing environmental and health disparities in our own community, as well as some of the other disparities that I've mentioned, such as housing, the criminal justice system, etc. Over the last 4 years, what have we seen? How did we get here? We've seen the rollback or the elimination of over 125 environmental rules from EPA. Additionally, at the start of the pandemic, the EPA announced that it would dramatically reduce the enforcement of environmental laws, making people more vulnerable to air pollution and water contamination. This is totally unacceptable. I look forward to working with the incoming administration to reverse and to strengthen many of these laws and protections. House of Representatives, which I'm a part of, has also taken steps to provide resources and support through a recently introduced bill called the Environmental Justice Now Act, which I was honored to work with Representative Grijalva and McEachin on this bill. And I've participated in a number of virtual listening sessions with EJ communities across the country. This bill, the Environmental Justice Now Act, will strengthen the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination based upon disparate impact and allow private citizens, residents, and organizations to seek legal remedies when faced with discrimination. It will also require the consideration of cumulative impacts in permitting decisions under the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. It also will ensure that permits will not be issued if a project cannot demonstrate a reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. It also authorizes $75 million annually for grants to support research, education, outreach, development, and implementation of projects which address environmental and public health issues in environmental justice communities. And finally, it establishes a federal energy transition economic development assistance fund, which will use revenues from new fees on oil and gas and coal industries to support communities and workers as they transition away from greenhouse gas dependent economies. Needless to say, we have not asked the oil and gas and the fossil fuel industry to pay their fair share. And now is the time to do that with the new Congress, and to use that money to deal with the impacts, especially in those communities that suffer the greatest impacts because of this, because of these operations. We have to prioritize these communities in legislation. This is the first major piece of legislation. I'm sure there are others, but it's a major piece of legislation that does that. And we have to, in any plan that we do to deal with climate change, and we will, we have to prioritize the communities that are the most impacted to that. Tonight, I'm joined by several panelists who've been working tirelessly throughout the pandemic to ensure that Long Beach residents are safe, supported, and empowered to protect their community and their loved ones. Each panelist will provide a brief introduction of who they are and what their experience has been throughout this pandemic. Then after each of the panelists have given their remarks, and all of the panelists have given their remarks, I will ask some questions to our panelists to better understand where we go from here, and what they are advocating for the recovery and what they advocate that the new administration put on its plate and do things. Our first panelist is Taylor Thomas. Taylor is the co-director of the East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. Thank you for joining us, Taylor. Can you tell us a little bit about East Yards and what you've seen and learned from the community members you work with throughout this pandemic?
Sure, thank you, Congressman, and good evening, everyone that is able to join. My name is Taylor Thomas. I use she, they pronouns. I'm from Long Beach, California on Tonga territory, and we are a grassroots member-led community-based organization fighting environmental racism in Long Beach, Commerce, Southeast LA, and East LA. And some of our campaigns include pushing for transportation equity in the 710 freeway expansion, anti-gentrification and community-led development on the lower LA River and Southeast cities, fighting for the cleanup of the over 10,000. Uh-oh, we have a...
Yeah, you're muted, Taylor.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Fighting for the 10,000 residential homes that have been polluted by lead emissions from XI technologies, and also fighting the NEPA rollbacks from the Trump administration. So we believe that the most impacted by pollution, frontline communities, which are mostly low-income communities of color, are the ones that are best equipped to fight these issues and determine what the solutions should be. And we do this by co-powering ourselves and each other to fight for the health of ourselves, our families, and our communities. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Taylor. Our next panelist is Sylvia Betancourt. Sylvia, I know Sylvia. She is the program manager at the Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, or LABACA. That's based out of Memorial Care Medical Center, or the Millers Children's and Women's Hospital. Sylvia, can you describe your work with LABACA and how asthma and other underlying health challenges have influenced your work over the past year?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. As Congressman Lowenthal mentioned, my name is Sylvia Betancourt. I work with Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, and we're based at Miller Children's and Women's Hospital. We're part of the Asthma Center of Excellence, which is a designation that our children's hospital holds. It's the only children's hospital in the state holding that designation, and LABACA is part of that continuum of care. What is extremely important about the work that LABACA has done over 20 years is that we work directly with children who have uncontrolled asthma, in particular in the areas that you were just discussing that include West Long Beach, Central, North Long Beach, all of Long Beach, and even Greater Long Beach. But these are the areas where we have the most, the highest rates of asthma and the highest need for the services that we provide. So we work with children and their families over a period of 6 months, doing home visits, providing home visits, and providing education about how to eliminate triggers for asthma indoor, and to address what are the ways that you can navigate it with the exposure outdoors. Over the last year, our work has really centered around a rapid response to the pandemic. When we started this year, we started with our home, doing our home visitation. And once the pandemic hit, it really became about needing to respond and to make sure that we didn't have any asthma emergencies that are preventable. We wanted to be sure that children were not going to the ER or being hospitalized. We wanted to be sure that we weren't diverting any needed medical services within the hospital to preventable kinds of emergencies. And so our work is really centered around that, around children, particularly who are vulnerable, who live in areas of Long Beach that are overburdened with pollution, and this work is centered around making sure that all of those around the child have education, what to do when that child has an asthma emergency, and also how to prevent it. So we work with multiple stakeholders, other community groups, decision makers, air quality agencies, and our mission is to change the profile of asthma for children in Long Beach and Greater Long Beach.
Thank you, Sylvia. Next, our next panelist is Danny Gamboa from Healthy Active Streets. Danny can tell a little bit about the organization and how the coronavirus has impacted the people that you work with.
Thank you, Congressman. Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Just coming off of what Sylvia just shared, I grew up in West Long Beach, and I have to carry one of these everywhere I go because I have asthma. Not only do I have asthma, my children have asthma too. And that's, a bummer, but it's actually quite common for folks in West Long Beach to develop asthma. Healthy Active Streets is a local project, and we're based out of Long Beach as well. Our mission is to educate, organize, and provide resources to underserved communities in order to achieve our goal and vision of regional mobility equity and environmental justice. And we do work on environmental justice issues through the Just Environment Long Beach Coalition, which includes some of the organizations that's on this panel. mainly East Yards and Lavaca, including, there's other organizations as well. What I have seen with the onslaught of the coronavirus is, all of the issues, all of the things that we were suffering in Long Beach, it's been exacerbated by the pandemic and the coronavirus. And I would like to also add, we've also been affected by the uprising. We know that our communities are those that seem to be over-policed, and there's a lot of talk about having this as a big social justice movement. It's a big reawakening or reimagining and revisioning of public safety. And I too welcome that conversation alongside the coronavirus conversation.
Thank you, Danny. I just want to indicate that I too suffer from asthma and carry the same inhaler, my little red inhaler, every 4 hours, 4 to 6 hours that you carry. So it makes me very, and makes me very sensitive to the pollution that's in the air and the dangers of the coronavirus, and the vulnerability that those of us that have asthma to the coronavirus. And the same thing, going back to Sylvia, I'm also aware of the tremendously high rates of asthma on the west side of Long Beach. And as I recall, when I was doing work with Lavaca years ago, when I was on the city council, there was twice the statewide average for absences from school on the west side in terms of asthma absences. I recall it those days, and that was a few years ago. There was about 17 to 20% of the children had absent from school because of asthma, and the statewide average was somewhere around 7 to 9% at that time.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Congressman, that's a really alarming rate for that time period, and and we have to think about what that does to children. They are missing school, falling behind, and their parents who are having to take care of them are missing work. It has multiple impacts on our families and ultimately on our community. And currently, when we think about the asthma rate and the use of ER departments in Long Beach, 57.3 out of 10,000 people in Long Beach use the ER. This is based on a community health needs assessment here in Long Beach in 2019, as compared to LA County is 44.3, and in the state it's 44 per 10,000. So you can see that there is a really marked difference for our community that shows that it's something we really have to address immediately.
Thank you, Sylvia. Let's move on though to and I want to thank you, Danny, also for your comments, to our final panelist, Chris Chavez. Chris is the Deputy Policy Director for the Coalition for Clean Air. Chris, can you tell us how you and the coalition have worked to address the ongoing health disparities in California, including the coronavirus, through environmental legislation and action? Maybe you can kind of fill us in, because I've worked over the years with the coalition, and you've done great work in terms of proposing legislation and action for all of us. So I welcome you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Congressman. So again, my name is Chris Chavez. I am the Deputy Policy Director for the Coalition for Clean Air. Coalition for Clean Air is a nonprofit organization. Oh, hold on one second, please. We're a nonprofit organization that is focused on policy advocacy in Sacramento and more at the local level as well. Our primary mission is to protect public health, improve air quality, and prevent climate change, though we know that climate change is already happening. One of the biggest issues that is coming up is that more research is showing that exposure to air pollution and exposure to different types of pollutants actually could put you at higher risk for more severe COVID symptoms. And actually, this is also personal for me as somebody who had childhood asthma myself as well, growing up in the Wrigley neighborhood for Long Beach. But also, I actually just found out today, 2 of my extended family members, one of them is in the ICU for coronavirus, and another one is actually having trouble getting medical attention because of the shortage capacity. So certainly a lot of work needs to be done, and a lot of it stems to the environmental justice issues that we've been dealing with for over a century. Really the impacts need to be understood and acknowledged that there are broader connections. So for Coalition for Clean Air's part, again, we advocate in Sacramento. We work also at the local level with the city councils, as well as the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the state agencies as well, to advocate for clean air policies, particularly from the transportation sector, as the transportation sector is the largest producer of emissions, both in terms of greenhouse gases. About half of our pollutants, greenhouse gas pollutants, are from the transportation sector once you include upstream emission sources, as well as 80% of the smog-forming pollutants in California.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Chris. And I think many of us, I think everybody here on the panel who lives on the west side and the northern part of Long Beach and the central part of Long Beach really knows about the impact of particulate matter and pollution from the transportation sector. We've lived with it, we've worked on these issues. And so I'm really glad, that you brought that up and mentioned that. What I'd like to do now is first thank you all for your introductions and for your dedication to serving our community and also the communities primarily in the west side, the north and the central part of the city, but not just those communities, also outside of Long Beach also, and also EJ communities. But I want to get into some questions now. Recently, I was shocked. I was at a community meeting when the director of the Long Beach Health Department announced that the life expectancy of someone on the east side of Long Beach is significantly longer, over 10 years, than someone who lives on the west side. And so what are we going to do about this? What are both the short-term steps and maybe the long-term steps or policies that we need to reduce this disparity? This is a shocking disparity that we're talking about. I mean, this is shocking. And how has this disparity continued because of the policies that we've already put into place? How have the policies that we put into place actually increase the disparity between the life term of people who are born on the west side versus the east side of Long Beach? And so what's maintaining it, and what do we have to do about it? And anybody can jump in. I see Taylor's shaking her head, so I'm going to call on Taylor first a little bit.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll give it a crack and I'll try to be brief so other folks can chime in. I think, we're looking at a whole host of historical and ongoing policies that contribute to the way that our neighborhoods have been designed, that the people who live in, resource limited areas have not had input in, right? So as an example, there's a major corridor on the west side called Santa Fe Avenue. It's a very heavy traffic street, and there's frequently accidents, but there's no bike infrastructure, lighting is poor, sidewalks are not well maintained. So these are things that the community continuously asks for, but we don't get. And politics obviously plays into that. So it's coming into why we're thinking about it in a way, it's like, why are our communities designed in a way that doesn't serve the people that live there? And it's because people in power are able to maintain these different types of policies, right? So when I think about different short-term steps that we can take that will help facilitate healthier communities, I'm thinking about stop expanding our freeways that will cut up our neighborhoods, remove homes and businesses, and increase pollution, right? Stop expanding warehousing, put an immediate end to fossil fuel capacity and infrastructure, have health protective zoning and planning, and even things like passing renter protections, right? I think there was a report that just came out that showed like the increase in evictions correlated with an increase in COVID cases and deaths, right? So when people don't have healthy homes, they don't have stable homes, they don't have stable neighborhoods, how that contributes to a further reduced quality of life. And long-term, we're looking at changing how policies function for communities, right? Like how is it that, you know, our municipalities can use eminent domain to rip up neighborhoods for private development, but we can't use it to decommission a part of an underutilized freeway to create green space for our areas, right? So thinking about the ways that the most impacted communities have a seat at the table and are a driving force in developing our communities, I think it is very critical.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in and talk about what they see as some of the immediate or the short-term steps to deal with this disparity in longevity versus some long time, and what you also see as some of the policies that have maintained this disparity and what needs to change there? Anybody? I'm open to listening to anybody.
Thanks. You know, what Taylor just mentioned is exactly right. We need to keep folks where they're at, and we need to stop displacement during the pandemic. As we speak, people are being served 60-day notices, and the 60-day notices during a pandemic, during an eviction moratorium, is inhumane. It's actually putting people's lives at risk. And you know, that to me is imperative, because I know people that are currently being displaced. As far as short-term goals, as far as policy ideas, I have a few ideas. Enforcing an anti-idling law, which California has an anti-idling law, but it's never enforced. It can't be enforced. We don't have enough enforcement, but every vehicle has an electronic logging device on board that tells you how many minutes it's idled every day. That can be done electronically, and it could be done with very little money, because ELDs are mandatory. Every truck has one. Every truck has one. The as far as the long-term strategies, I really do believe in like the bottom of my heart that Long Beach has never really addressed the systematic racism, the problem, the elephant in the room. The actual history of redlining has never really been addressed and been apologized for. So without, you know, really deconstructing these problems and systems and talking about them in a very upfront and honest way, then how are we expecting to get any change? You know, how are we supposed to get anything out of the Port of Long Beach when historically the mitigation funds go to the wetlands, nowhere near West Long Beach?
Very good points. Very good. Anybody else want to jump in and say anything? Sylvia?
Yes, I do. I'll try to be brief. As many people know, I'm not most commonly brief, but I do want to point out, so I was ready to talk about numbers and rates of asthma, the use of the ER, and I'm hearing many of us just on this call and from the people I know have a direct, either know someone who has asthma or have asthma. And when we think about the numbers, these numbers are more than just numbers. These are all real people. These are our family members, our friends, our neighbors. And it is extremely meaningful. Like in the work that we're doing, these numbers are not just numbers. They are real people. They're children. There are elders. There are parents. Our brothers and sisters. And so I want to point out how
Our Congress members.
Our Congress members, yes. And that's very true, because I did learn of other Congress members who had contracted COVID in this time period. And so we know it, we experience it. And I want to point out how extremely important it is for West Long Beach, for example, the zip code 90813. The ER rates due to asthma are the highest in the city. And there are also the highest numbers of COVID cases per 100,000 people. This is where we are experiencing it first and worst. And we know that because other studies have shown that the exposure to PM pollution has poorer outcomes if you contract COVID. Now, in these areas, we know that there's a cumulative impact. With cumulative impact, it's multiple sources of pollution. It's the amount of time that you spend in an area. It is the proximity to that source of pollution. And, we're talking about the freight transport industry and the refinery industry, all these industries that operate on fossil fuels that are directly adjacent to our communities. Now, if we're going to get to a place where we're addressing the use of the ER due to asthma, we need to, rather than get to the place where we're addressing it when it's an emergency, we need to address it upstream so that these problems are not being created in the first place. And that, when we know that PM pollution, particularly diesel, is harmful to children, that their lungs don't fully develop, that there are higher asthma rates, we know that we need to implement regulations that are reducing those emissions at the source. Because if our fence line communities are benefiting, then everyone else will benefit. Right? This is a priority for the most vulnerable communities in Long Beach. And so that being said, some of those things that I think need to be prioritized in terms of policy is health education and prevention, not to the point where we are, that it becomes an emergency. And also where there are reductions in emissions, there also needs to be a direct correlation with how you are demonstrating improvements in health, what those health outcomes are. And to date, they make a lot of claims about improving health and prioritizing health by reducing emissions, but there hasn't been a very clear correlation around how has health been improved. Because if, not only do the numbers speak to it, but if you ask your family member or your friend or neighbor, they're not feeling it.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'll move on. Chris, if you want to add something, but if not, there's lots of questions going forward.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize what Danny said about redlining, and that if you look at the Mapping Inequality Project by the University of Richmond and line it to what's defined as a disadvantaged community by the state of California, there's a very large overlap between disadvantaged communities of today and the redlined communities of yesterday. It's a very eye-opening comparison when you see that. I would also just point out that in terms of the health impacts, one of the things that people can look at is the South Coast Air Quality Management District has a study called the Multiple Air Toxics Exposure Study, or MATES. And the study examines relative cancer risk in different areas of their jurisdiction. It covers their entire district. And you see a very strong correlation to living next to goods movement corridors, so freeways, rail yards, ports, and the like, and an increase for the risk of cancer. And even when you just consider the district as a whole, the bulk of our air toxic cancer risk is from diesel particulate matter. So we have a very well-defined source and a very well-defined issue that needs to be addressed. And that diesel particulate matter risk is even higher in those frontline communities.
Thank you. When I recall studying and working off the MATE study, which was extremely important. I remember now talking about things, and the phrase came up. What we're talking about in terms of particulate matter, diesel, especially diesel, and especially along the freeways and towards the port on the west side. And this was when I was doing all this work in the 1990s and between 2000 and 2010. We used to call it the diesel death zone, is really what it was called, because those numbers are staggering in terms of just what Sylvia was talking about. The numbers are staggering. I want to move on to the next question. You know, sometimes we think of the courts as going to be our arbitrator, kind of balance, you know, some of these policies with communities' interests. But I want to ask you about what recently happened. In October, a federal judge approved a bankruptcy settlement allowing Exide Technologies to abandon, and the critical word here is abandon, its battery recycling plant in Vernon, just north of us here. The Exide facility had been releasing toxic lead pollution into the air for decades before being shut down. It impacted thousands of households in the surrounding community. The question is, here is they're letting Exide move away, abandon. How has this decision undermined public trust in government's ability to hold polluters accountable? I mean, how, you know, here's a decision, you know, that I think is going to impact the public's trust of government, that we're really going to hold these committees. And it's probably not, certainly not the first time, but I'm wondering, what do you think? How are you outraged as much as I am, maybe? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
Well, certainly, Congressman, and it is absolutely an outrage. And for Coalition for Clean Air's part, we did speak both during the Department of Justice meeting, you know, the scoping meeting that they had regarding, I guess that's not the right term, but they had a public workshop on the proposal from Exide. So, you know, we spoke out against it, but really, I think who really needs to be highlighted is community opposition. You had local elected officials, you had community members who really stood up and spoke and defended their communities, and it absolutely is it's tragic, because this really undercuts the faith that folks may have in the ability for EPA or Department of Justice, those two agencies, to actually protect environmental justice and environmental health. So it's absolutely a big problem. And for the incoming administration, it's going to be a challenge on two fronts. I think, one, that there's going to be a lot of pressure, and rightfully so, on the new administration to reverse some of these these crimes really that have happened to the community through the Trump administration. Again, like Department of Justice and EPA siding with Exide and pushing forward that bankruptcy settlement. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to reverse that course. At the same time, the administration is also going to have to overcome bureaucratic inertia and hold over staff that may make it more difficult for the EPA and Department of Justice, or the federal government in general, to change and to align with the new priorities of the incoming administration. But even if we take kind of a broader look at it, I think one of the most important issues at the local, state, and federal level is the need for agencies, for governments, for public services to actually be consistent with pledges for clean air and environmental justice. One of the things that passed in California is a bill called AB 617 in 2017. And part of it requires the Air Board, the California Air Resources Board, and the air districts to develop localized emission reduction plans for highly polluted communities. Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach is one of those communities. And me and Sylvia are both a member of the community steering committee that helped design that emissions reduction plan. That's great, that this plan was developed, but now the struggle, now the job is making sure that one, South Coast Air Quality Management District, Air Resources Board, State of California, City of LA, City of Long Beach, all this multitude of government agencies, making sure that they stay consistent with that plan in their implementation, and that they actually continue to engage with and have that plan in part owned by and implemented by the community. It's a challenge. In San Bernardino, another community that was nominated for it, the state of California is considering moving a rail yard to that to a mile away from their AB 617 community. So that is a clear-cut example where there is an inconsistency in implementation.
Thank you. Anybody else? Let me go on then. This has been a very interesting conversation. And I think you've all anticipated the next question, because we're not just talking about air pollution in these communities. I think Danny had mentioned it, Taylor also earlier. There's also the need and the lack of affordable housing, rental assistance, safe, well-paying jobs, educational resources, a reimagined public safety that the community supports. All of these are intersecting and interact. How do you deal with these intersecting challenges in your own jobs when you see that it's not just one thing, or that you can deal with? We're not just talking about air pollution in certain communities. We're talking about the intersection of many, many different things that are coming to me. So what, in your own work, do you deal with that intersection very much of all these different issues, and how?
I'll start. So when I started advocating for bicyclists, because I rode a bike and a bunch of my friends were being hit, and I've been hit by a car twice. And I started noticing that a bunch of folks were dying riding a bike, like something that I love to do. Now I don't advocate for bicyclists, I advocate for people. And I advocate for people's right to be safe within their own community. So a person like myself should be able to walk down the street without being harassed. I should be able to feel safe in my own community. I should have, housing. I should have access to an education and jobs. So all of these things are intersecting because, just for me personally, I stopped advocating for the mode of transportation that I was currently using or that I cared for, and I started advocating for folks. All of these issues intersect, and you can't walk down the street and feel safe if we are over-policed. You can't walk down the street if you can't afford to live in this neighborhood, because rent is unaffordable, housing is unaffordable, and if your job happens to move, like a bunch of companies seem to be moving, do you move there, or do you find another job? And things are very, very unsure at this moment, and the quarantine and coronavirus only exacerbated all of these issues.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? Okay, got lots of questions. I want to follow up on something that Sylvia talked about before. Maybe any of the others can also jump in on that. When Sylvia said, well, it's very nice, the ports and community leaders frequently talk about the reduction in pollutants that really have come from the port. But I'm on the front line, and I see just as many kids hospitalized. I see the same rates of absences from school. I see the same health disparities that are going on. So Long Beach is at the center of the nation's goods movement system. And how can industries like the port become leaders in sustainabilities that have impacts upon your community? I've already heard one saying it'd be really nice if the mitigation monies did not just go for environmental impacts outside, but that we had a broader view of what mitigation is and that the impacts that does on our community. And so the money should be going back into the community, and maybe that's a policy that needs to be changed. But what else? What would you like to see the ports do, as in addition to, and maybe you can use, to mitigate much more, and I think you can expand upon that. But what else would you like to see the ports? We're talking about the largest complex in the United States. Almost 40% of the nation's goods come in and out. I was just on a call today with the ports, and they have in the last 6 months seen a huge increase in imports in the last, and that's continuing. So even though the rest of us, many people lost their jobs, losing their rent, the throughput, and I'm not blaming the ports for this, because it's the nation is still, or at least some people are still probably online more than anything else, purchasing all these goods that are coming through. So what do we want to ask the ports to do next? How are we going to have them deal with this? They've taken some stands, but I gather from what we're hearing is that maybe more needs to be done. And give me some examples of what you'd like to see them do. They're your neighbors.
Well, full disclosure, Congressman, I am a truck driver. And in my day job, I drive a big truck. But the truck I drive is a zero emissions truck. This is I work for Project Portal with Toyota, and this truck pollutes zero. It pollutes water. It runs on hydrogen fuel cells.
So you'd like to see it for sure, that what we're doing, that we, not set goals in the future and do, but really move quickly towards zero emission systems right away, trucks, and make sure if you're going through a community and you're coming out of the port, we have now the ability, if we had the will, to really create a zero emission train. That gets back to what Chris had said before too, when he talked about the amount of pollution that comes from the transportation sector. And obviously the goods movement sector is one of the major culprits in that. We are seeing the movement of goods, even in this pandemic, whether it's locally, whether it's nationally, whether it's multimodal, right? And what you're saying is the first thing you'd like to see is what you're doing is driving a zero emission truck.
Not just the vehicles, but we need to also invest in the infrastructure. Right now,
Absolutely.
The Port of LA and Long Beach are investing in rail lines. They're expanding the rail. We just got a new bridge. And that new bridge is to allow bigger ships to come into our port, which will increase our pollution. So our communities get to shoulder the burden, the pollution burden of those tailpipe emissions, but we get nothing for it. That might be more.
No. Well, I will tell you also that one of the things that we're trying to do in Congress, and I'm going to back up a little bit before I get to that very point about what we're trying to do now in terms of infrastructure needs and how critically that issue is that you've raised, in that in May, we passed in the House of Representatives a HEROES Act, which was over a $3 trillion fund to really provide for this nation rental assistance, housing assistance, no foreclosures. We passed stimulus pay. We passed $600 a week in addition in unemployment benefits. We passed the ability to really have a national testing program with contact tracing, and to hire people to do contact tracing to protect communities that are the most vulnerable. Right now, we don't do that. We don't have that ability to identify where the virus is spreading, and we know where it's spreading, but we don't do it early enough. We're not able to do prevention. And I will tell you, one of my greatest sorrows about being in Congress has been the lack of urgency, and we still have not passed anything since May, and people are dying, and we don't really. It becomes very much of a political question, and I think it's an inhumane question right now. I think it really borders on inhumanity from, when we don't look at who is receiving who is getting the virus, and why aren't we getting those resources into those communities? And gets back to the second point that I was going to say is what you're saying is, we can build all the, just a simple example, we can talk about zero emission trucks, but if we don't have the infrastructure to fuel those trucks when they're out of the port, when they're going, if we don't build both electric and fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell kinds of stations all along, and that's what the federal government can be doing. It can be giving contracts and grants to the ports, but it also can be building as part of its infrastructure needs, infrastructure that really supports the ability to do this. Because if you have a car, if you have a truck, you can't take it anywhere because you get real worried. I'm going to be, oh my gosh, I'm going to be out there and run out. And that is really our responsibility to do that. And that was put forward again out of the House in our Moving Forward Act. Again, the Senate didn't want to take it up, and I am very optimistic, or at least very hopeful, that this next administration will really try to act to meet the needs of our communities and really deal with some of these critical issues, these intersections of everything. You can't just solve one without the other. So let me move on then. I have lots of questions. If anybody wants to jump in and tell me what else you'd like, besides Danny, what you'd like to see the ports doing, and I'd like to hear that also. Danny's talked about his own driving a zero emission a truck. Anybody else have anything you'd like to see the ports doing now at this moment, or that? All right.
Yeah,
yes.
I'll just very quickly add that I think the ports need to have their growth restricted. We can't keep expanding terminals and expanding operations. I think this is a larger symptom of how our society functions, is that business can continue to expand, but as we see, our planet can't sustain this. And so I don't expect that the ports will, actually do that. It's something that the communities will have to advocate for, but it's something that everyone should keep in mind, is that we can't have unlimited growth, because it comes at an expense to frontline communities, our environment, and ultimately our entire planet.
Taylor, that's a great statement, and you're right. That is not something that the institution, which is based upon its economic base, based upon growth, to do that is going to do without having communities themselves really talk about this issue. Do we want unbridled growth throughout the country? Is that where we want it? What is the optimal kinds of living arrangements that people need to have sustainable lives? And what you're saying is that growth is going to lead, no matter what we do, to more negative impacts upon vulnerable communities. That's a very good point.
I think where I wanted to draw the connection between the port and the proposal to expand the 710 freeway is that while the 710 freeway is a freeway that extends 20 miles inland from the port, that traffic, the truck traffic that moves along that corridor, exists because of the ports and port operations. And so in thinking about infrastructure and investment, some of that, the profit from the port, or that investment, should go back into the community if they're going to expand the 710 freeway. So that infrastructure should include any trucks that are operating on that freeway moving through in and out of the port should be zero emissions trucks. And there should also be, in order to reduce pollution, and there should also be job opportunities for those communities that are along the corridor to work on that project as well. And in terms of infrastructure and that cost, it really should be the port investing back into the communities that they're operating within.
Thank you.
And if I just
Chris,
may add,
seems like you're about to jump in.
yeah, I think one thing, since we're all kind of doing a round here, I think one thing that is important for the ports, but everybody to also, in terms of the policy world, to push it for, is overcoming the narrative that electrification of the ports or electrification of port operations entails or automatically includes automation, because you lose labor at that point. And automation is obviously a very big concern in terms of displacing employees and doing impacts to the communities. We need to find a way to electrify our ports without automating, where you still have people doing jobs that they have, or if there is a situation where there is an automation element included in it, is doing like what happened with the Long Beach Container Terminal project, which there was a project labor agreement that was put in place that helped protect employees. Certainly in terms of the impacts of that specific project, there's a lot of can be discussed about, but one of the best things is that there was that labor component to it. So making sure that we are able to talk about electrification without concerns about the associated job losses from automation is going to be hugely important for especially many of the communities that live in the front line, because a lot of the folks who live in those communities also, quite a few of them work at the ports as well, and or work in economies that are tied to dirty industries.
Right.
That's something always to be cognizant of.
Right. And they usually, when those port jobs are the best paying jobs, also good paying jobs. And so that raises another issue in terms of making sure that we include labor in all of this development, and that they're at the table as we work on redesigning our economy and our environment. I want to bring up something that, maybe Sylvia talked most directly about, but you've all talked a little bit about, that much of the work that you all do really focuses, at least in a significant amount, with young people and families. And I'm wondering, what are the concerns that you're hearing from parents and kids? And also, what has been the impact in your experience on having virtual learning in those communities that have the least amount of access to a digital ability to relate digitally? Here, we're closing our schools. Long Beach Unified is closed to online, to classroom instruction. It's doing it all online. How is that impacting the people that you're working with, and what are you hearing? Anybody?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. It's been very tough. I think even pre the pandemic, our folks were experiencing digital isolation, weren't getting the best access to quality education. And this has been exacerbated by having, not well-paying jobs in under-resourced communities. And so now with the pandemic, a lot of our folks are out of work. We have people living in multi-generational households, usually apartments. So it's very difficult for people to study, people to work, if they have access to the internet, if they have the technology like a laptop or a computer to be able to learn. And this unfortunately is a gap that a lot of community folks and neighborhood or groups have had to pick up. We're trying to figure out how to get people hotspots. We're trying to figure out how to get people laptops. And it's made it very difficult. I think ideally folks, especially our young folks, would have been given a gap year. But that's not the way it shook out. People are being asked to stay on a computer from 7, 8 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Even our young kids, like the ones in kindergarten and elementary school, they're being asked to do this. And so just imagine that, and dealing with the effects of the pandemic on top of it, not having steady food, not having steady income, folks getting evicted, right? So it's just been a compilation of a lot of negative issues for a lot of the families. And then on top of that, we're still dealing with the pollution impacts and trying to intervene in these different projects that are impacting our communities. And so the work that folks have had to do hasn't stopped, it's just increased, and often to the detriment of our families.
Mm-hmm. And I,
So,
in particular as well, because our community health workers are directly on the front lines with families, communicating while they're in their homes, we've had to shift from actual home visits to virtual home visits, phone calls, and so on. And we're in a place where we're not able to always rely on doing a virtual home visit, to do it via Zoom, for example, because there's a limited connection in the home. It might be that the child is already using Zoom to be connected to school. So, for parents to be able to connect via Zoom, there may not be enough capacity for their Wi-Fi in their home to be able to connect. We've also heard stories from parents who say that there's a disconnection while their child is in school. So they're just getting disconnected from their class. And it just is, it has been a challenge. I also want to highlight how Danny had started, he's mentioned it a couple of times, how how COVID has exacerbated many of the existing problems. It definitely did come in to just amplify the problems that already existed. So for families, from the start of the pandemic, people were told you've got to stay at home, but our homes are also places that can make us very sick because of the habitability issues, because they're located right next to polluting sources. So we want to be sure that people are able to take care of themselves, and then to also disinfect their homes in ways that are safe, so that they're not triggering another asthma episode. And so that being said, their connection via the web is very limited, and so we needed to be sure that we're able to reach families. And the other part of that is that the fires have also prevented people from being able to just go outside to, catch a breather if you need to, because you've been isolated at home for, so many hours. And it has been really, it just exaggerated several months, I think, through the summer up to now, because we still had a fire in the last week that impacted our air quality. So connecting digitally has been very limiting and isolating for many of the families.
thank you.
I wanted to bring up
Dan.
just one of the things that may have not been mentioned so far. I wanted to focus in on mental health. I have a child in high school and I have a child in college. And, one of the things I've noticed is that the pandemic and the fires and just about everything, including the administration, has taken a toll on everybody's collective mental health. And students sometimes used to be able to connect with other students or in person, or with the counselor at school, or with the teacher, but now it's virtually, and you're in a scenario like this where there's 20 of us or 50 of us here, and there's no personal time, right? And so there's that missing of connectivity with folks, and then also, I think it's taken a toll, collectively, on all of our mental health.
I'm glad you brought that up, Danny, because I believe that frequently mental health issues are overlooked. And there is no doubt, we now know that suicides are up, depression is up, anxiety is up throughout the nation, everywhere. People can't sleep, that we are really paying a huge toll in our ability to feel good about ourselves, to kind of navigate our environments. You know, we're going through an extremely difficult time in terms of our psychological well-being as a society. And those folks who are the most impacted are going through the most difficult of that. They don't have the ability to escape it all. They don't have the ability to, to get out, they're the frontline workers. They are the people who have to be at work. That in and of itself, can you imagine going to work and never knowing whether you're going to die? Whether you say it or not, you're experiencing that, you're seeing it, you're feeling it. So I think you're right. This is not something that's going to change overnight either. We're not going to just throw a switch when the vaccine is here and everybody's mental health is going to get better. All of a sudden, we're going to have to come to grips with that lack of connectivity, as you put it out, that lack of support, that ability to touch each other. It's going to take some time to reestablish. And for some people, they have been, just like what has happened in warfare and others, they have been traumatized. There is post-traumatic, pandemic disorder, and it's really true. It really is. And we've seen, in terms of trying to deal with post-traumatic stress situations, that it takes a long time to work on that. People have been traumatized, whether early experiences in life that traumatize them, or overwhelming war experiences, or military, or abuse. And now people have really been traumatized also by this pandemic. And so I'm very glad you brought that up. I think we always have to remember that and understand that how people are reacting is they're having a tough time frequently, very, very tough time. I want to talk about how we get some of the issues that you're talking about into traditional environmental kinds of policies. Now we're talking about at a policy level. The environmental community historically came out of a real attempt to protect wilderness areas, to protect forests and so forth. And I'm not thank goodness that we did it. But now, as we have moved in the last number of years, and especially recently, to understanding climate change and the impacts of what's going on, we're seeing that climate change is a racial justice issue. It's not a wilderness area as much. It's a racial justice issue. And how do we include now issues about racial justice, income disparities, health? How do we get that involved when we're designing environmental policies? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Because the alignment should be that EJ issues and that's what you bring to the table, the intersection of all of these issues and the impacts upon certain communities, not just, nobody puts down the wilderness part, but the other issue is critically important, that we're now talking about racial justice. We're talking about income disparity, inequality. We're talking about lack of housing. We're talking about children who have food insecurity. All you have to do is turn on TV, if you're not seeing it already, and watch the almost miles of cars in these states trying to get some food, So how do we impact environmental issues and the environmental community? How do we make that, broaden those kinds of policies? Maybe check with, have you worked with the larger environmental communities? Right. And with other environmental, not larger. I don't think anything is larger than what you're doing, but with the existing kind of environmental groups. And have they been have you worked out ways in which we can look at? Or is that not really what should be done? I'm just throwing it out.
Yeah. And so from Coalition for Clean Air's perspective, and to be clear, we're not an environmental justice group per se, but we certainly agree with many of the principles in their work. But we are considered more of a mainstream environmental organization. What I would say, though, is that it's very important for all environmental organizations to support environmental justice, because ultimately, to get people to care about the environment, you have to address the issues that they're dealing with. We have to get beyond the notion of, I hate saying this, but saving the polar bears when people in our own communities have a hard time breathing the air that they're exposed to. With the climate crisis, one of the biggest issues, again, in that intersectionality with housing, is that low-income communities and communities of color live in lower quality housing stock. They live in unair-conditioned apartments, and those communities also have less tree coverage. And because of that, those areas suffer from what's referred to as the urban heat island effect, in which that they experience hotter temperatures because the concrete and asphalt that they're surrounded by absorbs and retains the heat. So that they're experiencing even more extremes because of by a factor of where they live. I think one thing in California that has moved in the right direction is the California Climate Investments Program, due to the work of now City Council member Kevin De Leon and now Congressman Jimmy Gomez, is that a portion of that revenue is specifically marked for this disadvantaged community definition by the state of California. And I think that is part of it, is that the state has to commit to directly investing in the community and doing it in a way that does not promote gentrification, but actually empowers the community. So really doing direct investments into these long neglected, long impacted, discriminated against communities, but also making sure that we're empowering them and not just going in as a government agency, going in as with a project saying this is going to make everything better. What the community knows, what the community needs, and having them have ownership and being at the driver's behind the wheel in supporting these programs is very important. And I think that is a direction that we need to support as organizationally, but also in the terms of actual policy.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I do. I speak to this particular question, Congressman Lowenthal, from a personal perspective, and not just as a professional. I work, at a hospital, but I did grow up in an EJ community. My lived experience is that my family still lives in an EJ highly impacted community, but as do I. I live in Long Beach. And I recall that, many of the mainstream enviro organizations, I remember that years ago, there was one in particular that that promoted immigration as an environmental impact, that, they really were opposed to immigration and immigrant rights. And it was extremely contentious. In this country, there's a large, populations of immigrants who come in, through New York, through the southern border, and all along the West Coast. This is just it's an affront to immigrant communities when we think about that. The profile of EJ communities are, often these are communities of color, oftentimes communities that don't speak the language, don't speak English, or whose primary language is not English. And so when I think about those enviro organizations and their shift many have shifted to embracing and to supporting EJ communities, and in particular immigrant rights issues, and in this country, especially through this last administration. And I think about the environmental justice principles. Environmental justice principles are really embedded in a community speaks for itself. A community knows what it needs. And so it's not simply changing your language to support the community that's impacted, but it is recognizing that community members have solutions for their own, for the problems that exist in the community, or those ideas. It's the investment in those communities, investing in well-paying jobs in education and in health that is accessible, that is quality. And so I think that in this time, EJ groups really are, have been taking the lead in making those kinds of demands. And you see it, and it's just growing from the community, right from the bottom up.
Not seeing anybody else jump in. I have one last question this evening, and that is two parts to it. And you can either respond or not, or to one. One part is, what is the greatest hope that you have for your community? And the second part is, what question should I have asked you that I didn't ask? Would you have liked me to ask? And you can answer whatever you would like to say. Something that you think we either did not talk about that really needs to be addressed, because I think we've talked about a wide range of topics, but there may have been something. And if not, what's your greatest hope? If we're successful, what is it going to mean in doing some of the things that we've talked about in terms of promoting well-being in communities, empowering communities? We thought, what's your greatest hope? You talked about lack of not wanting to see communities just gentrified and people have to leave their communities. I think we've touched on a lot of topics. What is your hope for the future? All right, I'm going to call on you, Taylor.
Yeah, I'll
What
go
is
ahead.
your
I'm always hopeful and inspired by my community and the people in my community, because I think, when we look around and we see all the failures in our societies, I can always count on my community to come through and support me, and vice versa. And I think, just to add to the previous question that you asked, folks have to remember that frontline communities are the canaries in the coal mine, right? Before we see an ecological collapse somewhere, I don't know, in the Midwest or the global South, there's a community living next to a refinery that's raising the alarm about the issues that they're seeing and not being taken seriously. Just as an example, I read a National Geographic article about birds that are being burned by methane flares, right? And they can't see this, and those are apex predators. So if they, they disappear, then that'll cause an ecological disaster. But there are communities that are screaming about our refineries, the fossil fuel infrastructure, and trying to hold these entities accountable to prevent that, wave of impacts that will follow when these industries are not held accountable. So I look to our young people, I look to the wisdom from our elders, and I look to my community for inspiration.
The others, what is your greatest hope? Or what would you like me to address that we haven't?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for hosting this, and certainly greatly appreciate this conversation. And I think this, rather than a question that I think should have been asked, I think I would like to ask a question, and that is, given congressional procedures, things are oftentimes done through the amendment process. They're oftentimes done through budgetary markups. They're oftentimes done through reconciliation. How can we as advocates and as community members keep up with that process? How can we as advocates for environmental justice effectively weigh in being able to affect that, especially for organizations like my own? I would imagine the other ones on this panel, we don't have like permanent Washington, D.C. staff. What do you think is the most effective way for us to operate and influence federal policy?
Well, that's a great question. And I can only share with you what I do. And so to do that, I think that communication with my district and for those about what I'm doing and what bills are coming up and how to influence, what the impacts and what's going on. I have a weekly newsletter that I put out, and I take it very seriously to try to share with my community some of the very things that you're saying. We're going to be dealing with this. we're dealing with that issue, so that you can see what to do. And I also take very seriously whenever I get emails or letters. And I think that's another way. Usually it's the more personal letters. I spend less time if I get a form letter with 1,000 people on it, but if I get one that I think the person spent time doing it, I'm going to respond much more so to that one. Not that I won't respond to the others, I do, because that indicates there's a large number of people. But I try to respond to most of the mail that comes in. So we've got to be a sense of community as ourselves, and I can't be separate from the community, and I can't. And people have to feel like they can access, and they have my office and ask those questions. If you're saying what's coming up, you're right. I think we're at a unique time at this moment because we're at the beginning of a transition, and a transition in presidency, a transition in the administration, a selection of new people who are going to be in the administration. And I think this is a great time to try to impact that, and also, and to see because what the president-elect is going to do is to lay out an agenda real soon about what, at least from the administration's point of view, what they think is going to be the critical issues. I think so much of things that happen at the local level also. And I think the way you get involved and find out how you shape things, besides in Washington, which moves at a much slower pace than it is to really be involved in your own community and your own impact, electing city council members, asking those city council members, as was pointed out, to fix up Santa Fe Avenue, Why are you not holding people accountable? And Long Beach's city council is going through a transition now. First time we've had someone from the Cambodian community ever elected to the city council. And I think a lot of what happens in Washington is a reflection of what comes up from the people and what the city is talking about. So I think you've got to stay in contact with your own council and also your state legislature, knowing what they work on. For me, I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, so I'm going to be working a lot on those kinds of issues. I really work in 3 different areas at the federal level. Not that I don't deal with a lot of the issues in every area, but I work on sustainable infrastructure. That's what I'm really concerned about. Issues I work on. And have had a long history of working with the ports and trying to move them towards sustainability. I work on moving I'm the chair of the subcommittee on energy and mineral resources, which means that I am trying to work on moving in the transition from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy. How do we do that? What do we do? How do we reward, or not, maybe reward is not the question. How are we going to deal with those communities that would depend, like EJ communities, but also just communities that were so dependent on fossil fuel for their jobs? How are we going to help them? Are we going to have another thing like the Rust Belt, where we just left those communities as we moved away from that kind of management? We have to deal with that. And how do we really incentivize and create jobs and for renewable energy? And I also do a lot of work on international human rights. I think the United States has lost we used to be trusted much more throughout the world for a country that at least had a set of values and lived up to them. We're not trusted anymore, and trust doesn't just come back right away. We don't stand for things in our foreign policy that I think are really important. I mean, we do stand for wanting to have economic relationships and we have allies and not, but we don't really stand up for human rights. We really don't, we really stand up for countries that if they want to trade with us, if they want to get, the benefits of having this commerce with the United States. They cannot keep imprisoning people in their own country. They can't keep sending people, journalists and students, and in my district, I work very closely with the Vietnamese community and which is in Orange County, and the Cambodian community, because they are refugee communities that still have relatives and relationships with both Cambodia and Vietnam, and both those countries have become repressive countries, and the United States has not provided moral leadership. It's not standing up for them. It's not fighting for them as much. And I also think that I'm working on issues of, I think it was pointed out, our immigration policies are just outrageous. I go to federal court because people are being deported, have been, and try to keep them from deportation and ICE, and we lose a lot of people in the 47th congressional district because of raids, and that's outrageous also. So those are the specific things. And I also think it's that somehow we have to redefine what we're doing to make it really understandable to people. We need to deal with the underlying and the things that we haven't dealt with for centuries, and that's the racial disparity and the inequalities and the discrimination that's built into all of our institutions. And we started with the police, but we can't stop with the police. And with the police, we really have, I think one of the major first steps was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which really didn't deal with defunding or that. It said, we're going to hold the police accountable. We're going to have a database. We're going to let communities see who is being engaging in inappropriate behavior. Right now, it's protected. You can't see it. Communities are left out of the process. We set standards, also raise the standards of police, pay them more, make sure that who becomes a police officer, we ensure that they have an understanding. You're shaking your head? No, Danny, why?
Being in law enforcement is not a legacy job. It's a job that I think you should be applying for every time you put the badge on and carry that gun. We should not be paying them more.
Well, we're not talking about the people. I'm talking about who can get into it. I think the standards for getting into police work are very, very low. It's usually very physical. I think we should demand people have much more skills before they engage in much more understanding of communities. That's what I'm talking about.
I agree with that. I actually had a conversation with the high-ranking sheriff once, and I asked, hey, why don't you, to be this and to be that, you need a bachelor's degree. Why don't you require a bachelor's degree to go into the academy? And they said that study shows that candidates that obtain an education are less likely to shoot people.
That's right. No, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly that issue. We should be recruiting people who have understanding of from the communities that they're serving and have spent some time thinking about these issues and working on these issues. And that means upgrading the standards tremendously. Well, I think I'm going to draw it to a close then. I want to thank you all for your work. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something from each other. I hope we can continue this conversation into the new year. It can't be worse than this year. It can't be worse. New year can't be worse than this year. And somebody said, you think it can't be worse.
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood, but it can't be. And I want everyone to wish everyone a safe holidays, a happy Hanukkah, and be safe. And because these are very, very stressful times. Okay, bye now.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That concludes our meeting tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Good night.